through 16.
Okay, guys, so I forgot to record this on Friday, and I can tell you're all really anxiously awaiting this, considering I've gotten no emails about this. So anyway, here's your video. I think in second period we got further, but I'm going to start this where first period got. So guys, in second period, just skip ahead a little bit to where we left off. I think in both classes for the structure of government video, we got here to the Guardian Council. So remember, the purpose of the Guardian Council is to veto legislation that comes from the parliament that would go against Sharia law, and then they also have the ability to determine who can run for office at all levels of government. And historically have been known to cut many people. They keep people who are reformists out of government historically. So we did that. So then the Assembly of Religious Experts, this was one that you guys read about, so just really quickly, you should have read, they have 86 people, they're directly elected, they serve an 8-year term, and their most significant job is to pick the supreme leader, and then also, technically on paper, they have the right to dismiss him, but that has never happened. Of course, we're only on the second supreme leader, and just like every other position, the candidates have to be approved by the Guardian Council. Okay, so the Expediency Council is a group of advisors for the supreme leader, so they are not people who are voted on. It includes 32 people who are appointed, and then it includes the president, the chief judge, like the Speaker of the House, the Speaker of the Males, and jurists from the Guardian Council. They serve a 5-year term, and their job is to settle any disputes that come up between the Parliament, the Males, and the Guardian Council. Remember, the Guardian Council can veto laws, so if the Males believes there's something that should not be vetoed, they're there to help the supreme leader determine what really upholds Islamic law. And they can also create their own legislation in addition to the parliament. So the president is Rouhani, and he's the head of government. Remember, the supreme leader is the head of state, Rouhani is the head of government. The president serves a 4-year term with an 8-year consecutive term limit. As we've been talking about, they're directly elected by the people. Everybody can vote in Iran, everybody who's 18 or older. You do have to win an absolute majority of votes, so there's usually a runoff election between the top 2 vote getters, and it's a week after the original election. Again, candidates have to be approved by the Guardian Council. We talked about 2009, about the accusations and protests about voter fraud with the Green Revolution. In 2005, this is the year Ahmadinejad first took office, they disqualified 1,000 candidates and left 7 on the ballot. So they tend to leave out people who are, again, particularly reformist or extreme. And also women tend to get left off the list as well. The president has to be between 25 and 75, so they do cap their presidency. Be interesting looking at the United States election, considering, we've got some people who are wanting to run for office coming up who are over that limit. You cannot be a religious minority and hold the presidency. The parliament does allow minorities to hold seats, but you cannot hold the presidency unless you are Shia Muslim. Basically, they do what most presidents do. I was telling second period, go with the obvious things. They create a budget. They present that budget to the parliament. They sign laws. They appoint members of the bureaucracy. In this case, remember, Iran is a very centralized unitary system, so there's not a lot of authority in terms of local governance, and they appoint governors, town mayors, and ambassadors, and that's all very centralized and meant to carry out the wishes of the central government. Super short slide here. The bureaucracy, headed by the president, it's gotten much bigger since the revolution. It tends to be dominated by religious leaders, which is true of all the top members of Iran's government. They tend to be clerics. Okay, I think second period, this is maybe the last slide we did there. So the Males, the legislature, has 290 deputies that serve 4-year terms. Most of them are single-member districts, but they do include 28 multi-member districts. Tehran, for instance, has about 30 or so representatives. The next highest area has 6. So Tehran is highly represented in the legislature. And what's interesting is they do have 5 guaranteed seats for recognized religious minorities, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. It reminds me a little bit of China. In China, if you remember, in one of the videos, we discussed the fact that China holds seats specifically for ethnic minorities, not religious minorities, but ethnic minorities. They have direct elections, so it says a nonpartisan basis. That's really true. People don't run on the basis of a party. The 2 big groups within Iran are reformists and conservatives, and that's kind of where you get the pendulum swing between someone who's a reformist and then back toward more traditional values. It's also a 2-round voting model, so you have to receive 25% on the first ballot, and then they take the top 2 candidates who've achieved at least 25%, and they have a runoff actually several months later. I pointed out in the other class, they do serve a 4-year term, and this is not the same year that the president is elected. They are on off years, so you're not turning over the whole government at once. The legislature is pretty powerful. It's not a rubber stamp. And if you're asked to name powers of the legislature, keep it broad, just like you would with any of the other countries. When you name powers of parliament, you should always go with they have the power to enact laws, right? They're writing bills, they're enacting laws, in this case with the approval of the Guardian Council. They also appoint the other half of the members of the Guardian Council. So remember that the Supreme Leader chooses the first 6. The Supreme Leader has the power to pick the Chief Judge. The Chief Judge comes up with a list for other members of the Guardian Council, and then the legislature approves from there. They can investigate cabinet ministers and remove people from the cabinet, but not the president. They approve the budget. They approve cabinet appointments. They approve treaties. They approve loans. Very typical standard powers for a legislature. The judiciary is based on Islamic law, goes above all other codes, all other laws of the land. Sharia law is supreme. The Supreme Leader appoints the head of that judiciary, who then appoints all the senior judges. It's based on retribution law, meaning it's very strict, very harsh, sort of an eye for an eye sort of mentality here, that when somebody commits a crime, the punishment is likely to be very stern in response. I'm going to I sent an email to our Iran groups. Take a look at some of the laws, especially for moral activities. Take a look at, what does it mean to break the dress code? What does it mean to drink alcohol? What about divorce or committing adultery? So sort of moral things. And what's the difference between men and women? For instance, up until very recently, it was legal for women to be stoned to death for adultery, and the same was not true for men. By the books, that has gone away, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in practice that has totally gone away. The military, they maintain a regular army of about 370,000. The regular army defends the borders, while the Revolutionary Guard's job is to protect the public. Now, the Revolutionary Guard is the institution, the wing, that was just designated by President Trump as a terrorist organization. So I will pull an article on that for you guys, and I'm sure you'll be thrilled to read it, to get a little bit of a better look at what's going on there with that designation. So those commanders are appointed by the Supreme Leader, and they have their own separate ground forces, Navy and Air. They oversee, the strategic weapons, the nuclear program. This is something that's unique to Iran, these banyads, okay? So a banyad is, technically, it's a charitable foundation, and this is a term that we haven't seen in any other country and we won't see in Nigeria. Okay, here's the deal with these. By definition, they are a large, tax-exempt charity. The issue with a lot of these are really corrupt. So there are some that are not, and that do good things, and they provide lots of aid to people within the country. So we've got things like the Foundation for the Oppressed and Disabled, the Martyrs Foundation. What's interesting is that these provide social services to groups that normally the government would handle, but in this case they're autonomous and they're huge. Like the amount of money they have is tremendous. Most also, there's a mixing here between charity and the state. So they're autonomous, and yet they also supervise some state-owned property and state-owned businesses. After the revolution, so whenever time we say the revolution, that's in 1979, they were nationalized, and they were supposed to redistribute income to the poor, families of martyrs. That doesn't always happen. There are some that are extremely powerful, and the people who run them are extremely powerful and wealthy. There are over 100 of these in Iran, and they monopolize many sectors of the economy, like the cement industry, the sugar industry. So, it's a tax-exempt organization. It's been nationalized, and they run much of the economy and manage a lot of the money that's distributed to various groups of people. Parties are allowed to exist in Iran. People have the right, according to the Constitution, to assemble, to organize. After the 1997 election, we've seen weak parties that have tended to be organized around personalities, so they come and go as personalities rise and then fade. They're unstable. They change from election to election. The major coalitions, as I mentioned earlier, are between conservatives and reformists. Interest groups, however, are very weak. So civil society in this regard is very weak. One of the most prominent interest groups is something called Workers' House. It's a group of factory workers that have banded together, and they are working toward reforms in working conditions. But very few business interest groups have formed because the Iranian government actually still controls between 65 and 80% of the economy. Mass media. Originally, after 1979, speaking out against the government was criminal. Some of those restrictions have been lifted over time. Again, that's typically a good reform to go with if you're asked about how a place has become more democratic. Usually saying that the media has become more open is a good answer. There are some privately owned newspapers, magazines, but the major radio and TV stations are run by the government, by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Broadcasting is what it's called. And any publication does have to get a license from the government that can be taken away at any time. Every website that exists has to be registered with the government. So though there have been openings, it's still pretty tightly controlled. This is just a quick review about the elements of Iran that are theocratic and those that are democratic. So for you to go back, remember and kind of review those theocratic institutions, things like the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council, the Expedience Council, the Assembly of Religious Experts. Those are theocratic, where on the democratic side you have the parliament, the president, and local elected leaders. And the bureaucracy, too. The cabinet is also, chosen by the parliament. All right. That's it.